The academy stood like a crown on the hill, its stone walls pale against the endless gray skies of the English countryside. From a distance, Red Hollow Academy seemed untouchable, a fortress of learning where the children of dukes, bishops, and wealthy industrialists were molded into the next generation of leaders. The gates opened each morning to the polished wheels of carriages, to the sound of polished shoes tapping across cobblestones, to the whispered pride of families who believed this place would protect their bloodline from the decay of common life. But the closer one stepped, the more the air seemed weighted, as though the walls themselves had absorbed not only the laughter of children but also the silence of something long buried. The teachers who came to serve here often arrived with the hope of prestige and influence. But many left with nothing, not even their names recorded in the books of resignation. The records still show their arrival, neat and proper, inked in black upon yellowed ledgers. Men of letters, women of patience, tutors of music and language, all drawn by the promise of steady work within noble halls. Yet for some their departure was never signed. No farewell letters, no family claims, no forwarding addresses. They were there one week, gone the next, as if swallowed whole by the building. Parents were told of resignations, though no such documents could be found, and the teachers' wages often continued for weeks after their vanishing, as if to convince the world that they had chosen to move on. But within the academy walls, whispers grew, whispers of rooms that had no windows, of footsteps heard at hours when no classes were held, of books found marked with strange symbols that no one dared decipher. The academy itself was built not only as a school but as a monument to order. Its headmaster, Dr. Alaric Pembroke, had demanded the finest masons, the sharpest corners, the tallest ceilings, believing that a structure of severity would shape the minds of those within. Each corridor ran straight as an arrow, with no alcove where a child might hide, no curve where a teacher might turn without being seen. Yet despite its strict geometry, there were places the staff avoided. Rooms that felt too cold, staircases where sound echoed without cause, doors that seemed to breathe when left closed too long. The building was alive with silence, and in that silence, fear was born. The first teacher to vanish was spoken of only in low tones. A man of arithmetic, diligent but soft. He was said to have struggled with Pembroke's expectations. One evening he was summoned to the library after curfew. The next morning his bed was neatly made, his clothes still pressed in the wardrobe, his belongings untouched. The students whispered that he had been dismissed, but no carriage was seen leaving. Another followed weeks later, a woman who taught Latin hymns to the choir. Her absence was explained away as illness, yet her books remained stacked on her desk, a single page left half-translated as though she had stood and walked out mid-lesson, never to return. Fear began to creep beneath the polished surface of Red Hollow. Teachers kept their doors bolted at night. Some wrote frantic letters home, speaking of strange sounds outside their chambers or the sense of being watched when the hallways emptied. But those letters, too, went unanswered, for many never left the walls at all. It was said the postmaster had been instructed to hold any message marked with the academy's seal until Pembroke himself approved it. He claimed it was to protect the privacy of noble families, but to those inside, it felt more like a chain tightening around their throats. And yet, despite the growing unease, no one spoke openly. To challenge Pembroke was to invite suspicion, and suspicion here was not survivable. Instead, they walked the halls with lowered eyes, performing their duties with mechanical precision, pretending not to notice the empty chairs at the faculty table or the quiet scratching of chalk that seemed to come from the walls themselves after midnight. Each disappearance became a shadow folded into the next, until 17 teachers in all would be erased from memory, leaving only the academy standing tall on the hill, its stone walls reflecting the pale light of dawn, its silence masking the first notes of a horror that had only begun to unfold. Dr. Alaric Pembroke wore civility like a second skin, tailored as carefully as his dark wool coats. To the noble families who entrusted their children to Red Hollow, he appeared as the very picture of dignity, his voice calm, his manners polished, his mind endlessly disciplined. Bishops praised his devotion to scripture, dukes admired his precision in matters of etiquette, and industrialists envied the efficiency of his methods. He spoke often of enlightenment, of shaping children into instruments of order and reason, quoting John Locke with such authority that parents believed him touched by divine clarity. Yet beneath the admiration, behind the steady eyes and measured tone, Pembroke harbored an obsession that grew like a rot. To him, failure was not weakness but sin, and sin required punishment, not compassion. The doctrine he built for himself was stitched from fragments of philosophy and scripture, twisted until their meaning served his own hidden hunger. He spoke of the mind as a blank slate, but in his eyes mistakes etched scars upon it that could never be forgiven. He whispered of purity, of cleansing the spirit through suffering, believing that each lash, each silence, each broken body was a sacrifice that pleased both reason and God. The teachers under his rule felt the pressure of these ideas not through words alone, but through the endless inspections he carried out. He would walk into classrooms unannounced, his polished boots clicking against the wooden floors, his eyes scanning every movement with cold calculation. He never shouted, never raised his hand in anger in public, yet the weight of his gaze made teachers stumble over their own lessons, made them tremble as though judgment itself had entered the room. To the children, Pembroke was a distant figure, almost spectral, glimpsed in the hallways or at chapel, where his prayers lingered longer than any others, his voice droning with unnatural calm. But to the teachers, he was an ever-tightening noose. He demanded records of every word spoken in class, daily reflections written in ink on how their methods had improved, confessions of inadequacy offered like prayers. Each paper was read and annotated in his spidery hand, corrections underlined so sharply they cut into the parchment. When mistakes repeated, when weaknesses surfaced again, he summoned them, always at night, always alone. Pembroke's chambers were decorated not with comfort but with severity. Shelves of books lined the walls, yet many bore symbols scratched into the margins, strange notations that twisted scripture into rituals. Teachers who entered never sat in his presence. Instead, they stood while he circled them slowly, speaking of doctrine, of purity, of the sacred duty to purge weakness. He did not rage. He persuaded, explaining with chilling logic that suffering was necessary to lift the soul above corruption. He convinced some that their failings endangered the children's futures, that to resist his correction was to choose damnation for all. By the time he led them to the library's hidden stair, most followed in silence, as if already hypnotized by his twisted faith. It was here that Pembroke revealed his true self, not the admired headmaster, but the craftsman of suffering. He believed that every sin of teaching demanded a punishment that mirrored its nature. If a teacher's voice had faltered in hymns, then their throat was the seat of corruption, and it must be cleansed. If a mind had failed to grasp precision, then the body must be bound until it learned rigidity. Each ritual he created was both symbolic and devastating, designed not only to end a life but to inscribe a meaning upon it, a final lesson carved into flesh and bone. He recorded these methods in his private journal, written in language both scholarly and reverent, as if cataloging discoveries rather than atrocities. Those who disappeared became invisible to the world outside, but within the academy their absence left a chill that no fire could warm. Teachers began to carry a deep, silent fear, knowing that one misstep in a lesson, one forgotten phrase could be their undoing. their minds frayed under the constant threat, every day feeling like an examination with death as the examiner. Yet Pembroke thrived in this atmosphere. The silence of his staff, their terror that kept them obedient, confirmed his belief that his doctrine worked. In their trembling he saw order. In their disappearances he saw purity restored. And so the Academy's reputation continued to gleam, its walls standing tall as ever, while within, the doctrine of Dr. Alaric Pembroke spread like an infection, preparing the way for horrors still deeper, still darker, hidden just beneath the surface where no one dared look. The library was the proudest feature of Red Hollow Academy, a cathedral of books with ceilings that soared like the vault of a church. Rows of oak shelves stretched into shadow, filled with volumes that noble families boasted of to their peers. Children studied here under strict silence, and visitors spoke in whispers as though fearing to disturb the sanctity of knowledge itself. Yet beneath the polished floors and the scent of aged leather bindings lay another chamber, one that few would ever know existed. It was through the library that Dr. Pembroke led those teachers he had judged, guiding them past the shelves as if into confession, then down a narrow iron stair hidden behind a false bookcase. Each step echoed like a tolling bell, and by the time the stair ended, the world above seemed impossibly distant, as though the descent itself erased the chance of return. The chamber was nothing like the library above. Its walls were bare stone, cold and damp, but covered in chalk markings, scores, arithmetic errors, misspelled words, and broken lines of Latin. They sprawled across the walls like accusations, as if the very failings of the teachers had been pinned there to surround them on every side. The air smelled of chalk dust and rust, heavy with a faint tang of blood that never washed away. At the center stood a desk, carved from black wood, its surface scarred with knife marks. Around it lay instruments arranged with obsessive precision. Clamps, rods, needles, hooks, blades shaped like rulers, all gleaming in candlelight. To the untrained eye, they resembled surgical tools, but their purpose was not healing. Pembroke had designed them to be instruments of education in its most twisted form, each meant to correct the human body the way one corrected a child's penmanship. The first teacher who entered this chamber was a man whose failing had been hesitation. His lessons had faltered, his words stumbling in front of the students. Pembroke saw weakness in this, a flaw that might spread like disease if left unpunished. He spoke to the man softly, praising his devotion, then explained that a mistake in speech was no different than poison on the tongue. If the tongue could not carry truth with precision, it must be disciplined. He placed the teacher in a chair bolted to the floor, strapping his arms tight against the rests, binding his forehead against the wood. Then, with the calm of a physician, Pembroke produced a slender iron rod tipped with a thin blade and slid it into the man's mouth. Slowly, deliberately, he scored lines across the underside of the tongue, each incision shallow but agonizing, each cut marking a mistake repeated too often. The man's screams filled the chamber, but Pembroke silenced him by pouring chalk dust mixed with salt into the wounds, insisting that the correction must be remembered. The teacher was left broken, his mouth swollen, unable to speak again. By dawn, his absence was explained as sudden illness, while his body lay hidden in the ash pit of the furnace. This ritual set the tone for all who followed. Pembroke saw the chamber as a classroom, himself as the master, and each punishment as a lesson that had to be inscribed into flesh. To him, every instrument carried a meaning. The clamps corrected the spine of those who slouched in duty. The hooks tore into fingers that had faltered at writing. The sharpened rulers sliced into skin, measuring failure in lines of blood. He did not rage as he worked. His cruelty was methodical, his movements steady, his breath controlled. He believed he was saving the academy from corruption, preserving its purity by transforming human suffering into sacrifice. For the teachers summoned here, there was no prayer left. The chamber crushed not only their bodies but their spirits, forcing them to confront their failings written large across the walls. Some begged for forgiveness, others denied their faults. But Pembroke treated all the same, with cold devotion, as though he were a priest performing rites too sacred for the living to question. By the time the pain had run its course, he saw not agony but completion, as if their silence after death was proof that the lesson had been learned. And still above, the library remained untouched, its shelves glowing in candlelight, its halls filled with whispers of study and discipline. No student ever guessed what lay below their feet. No parent imagined that beneath the promise of knowledge was a hidden classroom where learning meant mutilation, where correction was carved into flesh until the body could no longer endure. For Pembroke, this secret space was the true heart of Red Hollow, the place where failure was erased, where his doctrine came alive in blood and chalk. It was not the books above that defined the academy, but the chamber beneath, waiting in silence for the next teacher to falter. In Pembroke's mind, the voice was the most dangerous organ of all. Words, he believed, carried contagion. A teacher's weak phrase could plant doubt in a child's heart. A single stammer could fracture discipline. A misplaced sentence could unravel years of order. He had read scripture that spoke of the tongue as a fire, a world of iniquity, and he twisted those words until they became law within his private doctrine. He convinced himself that to silence corruption was not cruelty but purification, that in muting the voice of the unworthy he was saving the minds of the innocent. Silence to Pembroke was not the absence of sound, it was perfection. The chamber beneath the library had already claimed lives, but this new ritual marked a refinement of Pembroke's philosophy, a moment where his obsession with control became inseparable from his cruelty. The victim chosen was a teacher of rhetoric, a man known for eloquence, whose careful speech had inspired admiration among the students. But Pembroke had found fault in his confidence. To speak with passion in Pembroke's eyes was to court pride, and pride was the seed of rebellion. He summoned the man with the same calm precision as always, guiding him down the narrow stair as though leading him to confession. The chamber was lit with low flames that night, their glow soft against the chalk-covered walls. But the instruments on the desk shone with a hunger of their own. Pembroke bound him upright, securing the head so that the mouth gaped open in enforced obedience. He spoke in measured tones, explaining that the voice was a vessel that must be sealed if it carried corruption. He held up a small ladle filled with hot wax, melted from the candles above, its surface shimmering like liquid gold. To the trembling teacher, the act appeared senseless, almost absurd, until the first drop slid down his throat. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, searing flesh as it hardened within. The man gagged and strained, but Pembroke continued, layering wax upon wax, each ladle poured with ritualistic care. He paused between layers, waiting for the convulsions to still, then began again, methodical, patient, as if crafting not a death but a lesson to endure beyond death. The chamber filled with sounds of choking, of muffled cries that struggled but could not escape. With every layer, the man's voice diminished, broken into gurgles, then silence. Pembroke's expression never shifted. His breathing remained steady, his eyes fixed with a strange reverence. He whispered that the voice had been a disease, that silence was a gift. When the final ladle was poured, the man's body jerked once, then collapsed against the restraints. His throat sealed forever, his voice erased as though it had never existed. Pembroke leaned close, listening for a breath, and when none came, he recorded the act in his journal, inscribing it as the doctrine of silence. This ritual marked a turning point within the academy. It was no longer enough for Pembroke to punish failure with physical correction. He now sought symbolic meaning in every death, binding pedagogy and torture into one seamless philosophy. Each disappearance became an allegory, each body a cautionary tale reshaped into ritual. The surviving teachers felt the weight of this shift even if they never spoke of it. They began to measure their words with obsessive care, fearing that a misplaced syllable, a tone too soft, or a phrase too bold might draw Pembroke's attention. They lived in dread not only of failing their lessons, but of speaking at all. Silence spread through the halls like an infection. Conversations dwindled, laughter vanished, even the sound of footsteps seemed hushed, as though the building itself understood that noise was dangerous. For Pembroke, this spreading silence was proof that his doctrine was working. He saw in their trembling restraint the reflection of his own order, the purity of control achieved through fear. But the silence also deepened his obsession. He began to believe that sound itself was corruption, that each voice erased must be balanced by greater discipline. His journal grew darker, filled with diagrams of the throat, notes on the resonance of hymns, sketches of instruments designed to crush the larynx or seal the lips with molten lead. What had begun as a punishment for one became a pattern he intended to refine, a ritual he believed could transform the academy into a sanctuary of perfect quiet. The surviving teachers bore the psychological scars of this cruelty long before their bodies would bear the physical. Some began to dream of wax, choking in their sleep, waking with raw throats as though the silence had already begun consuming them. Others avoided speaking entirely, communicating only in writing, hoping to hide their voices from Pembroke's gaze. Yet no silence was enough, for Pembroke could sense fear like a scent, and to him fear itself was weakness to be corrected. The doctrine of silence was not simply a belief he imposed, it was a contagion that spread through Red Hollow, warping minds and bending wills. It turned learning into dread, conversation into peril, teaching into a sentence of death. And while the noble families continued to praise the academy for its discipline, within its walls each lesson was now taught under the shadow of the wax. Under the knowledge that the next voice heard too strongly might be the next one sealed forever. The chamber beneath the library had grown colder with each death, as if the stone itself absorbed the screams that once echoed through it. Pembroke had begun to believe the place was consecrated, sanctified not by prayer but by sacrifice. He called it his true classroom, the room where error could finally be erased. Yet even within its silence, he saw a flaw in his earlier methods. The wax sealed the voice, but it did not leave behind a lesson to endure beyond the grave. He wanted more than silence. He wanted proof etched into the very last breaths of his victims that their failures had been transformed into obedience. It was this hunger that gave birth to the ritual of the blackboard. The blackboard was carried down into the chamber one winter night, its heavy wooden frame towering like a grim monument. Pembroke had instructed the students above that it had cracked in the cold and was being replaced, but in truth, it had been chosen for another purpose. Across its surface he rubbed a mixture of chalk dust and something darker, ashes scraped from the furnace where bodies had been burned to nothing. He mixed them carefully, ensuring that the dead became part of the lesson, binding their remains to the errors that filled the walls. To Pembroke, this was purification made complete, the failure of the past becoming the dust that would correct the present. The teacher chosen for this ritual was a young woman of history, one who had faltered when asked to recall a date before the children of nobles. To Pembroke, her error was not a mistake, but an insult to the order of time itself. He bound her before the blackboard, pressing a piece of chalk into her trembling hand. He instructed her with the same calm tone he always used, telling her that she must write her own obituary line by line, recording not only her name but her failings, her errors, her weaknesses, all while breathing the dust of those who had fallen before her. The ritual began with a simple line, her name and the word departed. Pembroke stood behind her, holding a shallow tray filled with chalk and ash, and with each word she wrote, he shook the dust into the air. The particles swirled in clouds, gray and acrid, filling her lungs as she gasped. At first, the coughing came in waves, breaking the chalk lines as she struggled to steady her hand. Pembroke corrected her grip with surgical patience, guiding her fingers back to the board, forcing her to continue writing even as her body convulsed. Line after line she wrote of her own undoing. Failed in memory, failed in duty, failed in devotion. Her chest heaved as the dust coated her throat, scratching raw, her lips bleeding as she tried to breathe through the storm. Pembroke poured more, his eyes fixed with reverence, whispering that every letter was redemption, that the ashes of her peers were cleansing her of error. The chamber filled with a fog so thick it clung to the walls, a cloud of death that left no space for clean air. The chalk snapped in her hand, yet he forced another piece into her grip, demanding the ritual continue until her body could no longer hold it. At last, her words broke into scrawls, the letters uneven, the obituary unfinished. She collapsed against the board, her chest rattling with a last desperate gasp. Her final mark smeared across the black surface like a wound that refused to close. Pembroke stood in silence, watching the dust settle, watching her still body slump beneath the words she had written. To him, it was completion. The obituary was not only written but breathed. Her life ended within the lesson itself. He unbound her corpse with care, laying her gently as though honoring a student who had passed an examination. Her body was carried to the furnace above, reduced to ash, which in time would be added to the same mixture on the board, ensuring her lesson would live on in the lungs of those who followed. Word of her disappearance spread through the academy like every other before it, explained away as sudden illness. Pembroke allowed rumors of fever to circulate, reinforcing the fear that the building itself demanded health and purity. The teachers, already cautious of their voices, now became fearful of their very breath. They felt dust in every corner, choking them in their sleep, making them wonder if they too were already breathing the remnants of the vanished. Some began to cover their mouths with cloths. Others avoided entering the library altogether, claiming they felt faint in its air. The more they feared, the more Pembroke believed his doctrine was truth. He saw their dread as discipline, their silence as progress. The blackboard remained in the chamber, its surface never cleaned, its lines blurred with layer upon layer of ash and dust. Pembroke began to call it his book of lessons, convinced that every mark, every word written by dying hands was sacred scripture of his own making. He alone read its scrawls, running his fingers across the jagged lines, breathing in the faint dust that rose, believing he was sharing communion with the dead. The blackboard no longer taught children. It taught silence, obedience, and terror. And in its shadow, Red Hollow descended deeper into a darkness that no family, no bishop, no noble would ever admit existed. The doctrine of silence had already transformed the academy into a grave of voices, yet for Pembroke, silence alone was not enough. He sought refinement, not only in philosophy but in practice, and the more he read, the more he believed he was destined to unite knowledge and punishment. He had followed with great interest the writings and lectures of scientific reformers who claimed the human body could be studied as a machine. Among them, Dr. Joseph Guillotin had spoken of instruments that could kill swiftly, mercifully in the name of progress. To Pembroke, such notions were naive. He believed science should not free man from pain, but use it as a scalpel to carve the soul into obedience. He twisted discoveries into scripture, recasting enlightenment as justification for torment. Where others saw medical possibility, he saw a new classroom, one where the body itself became the blackboard, nerves the ink, pain the lesson. It began with needles, those ivory slivers teachers often used to pin papers or stitch their robes. Pembroke collected them obsessively, smoothing their points until they gleamed like glass. To him, the needle was perfect, small, precise, able to pierce without shattering. He designed trays lined with hundreds of them, arranged like instruments in a surgeon's kit. He studied the anatomy of the nervous system with cold fascination, sketching diagrams by candlelight, marking where the threads of sensation ran beneath the skin. His notes were meticulous, and he believed that by touching the correct points he could command the body like a pen across paper. The victim he chose for this lesson was a teacher of penmanship, whose hands trembled when he wrote. Pembroke declared that his flaw dishonored the very act of writing, that the trembling must be corrected by turning his body into a perfect quill. The chamber was prepared with cruel ceremony. The teacher was laid across a long desk, arms bound wide, head strapped back so the eyes could not turn away. Pembroke began with the fingers sliding ivory needles beneath the nails, piercing nerves so that each digit twitched against the wood. The man gasped, his teeth grinding, but Pembroke continued, pressing more needles into his forearms, his shoulders, the base of his neck. Each insertion sent jolts through the body, sparks of pain that made the limbs spasm in jerks and shudders. Soon the man's hands began to move as though writing, his fingers clawing at the air, his arm dragging invisible letters against the desk. Pembroke leaned close, recording the motions in his journal, noting how the body, under the right pressure, mimicked the act of writing even in agony. He was not satisfied with hands alone. He pressed needles into the legs, the spine, the ribs, layering torment until the body writhed in convulsions. With every new point struck, the man's movements grew more frantic, as if writing not with chalk or quill but with his entire frame, the jerks and spasms sketching invisible letters of suffering across the chamber. Pembroke described it aloud as a human script, the body itself becoming a quill guided by nerves instead of ink. To him, the cries were not cries at all, but punctuation in a language only he could understand. The victim's spasms went on until exhaustion hollowed them into tremors, until blood trickled from the punctures, until his body sagged against the desk. Pembroke ended it not with mercy but with a final insertion at the base of the skull, silencing the quill forever. When it was over, the desk was soaked, the needles glistening with a sheen of red. Pembroke stood above it in reverence, his face calm as if the sight confirmed all that he believed. He recorded every detail with obsessive care, filling page after page with notes on placement, reaction, duration. To him, this was not death, but proof that failure could be transformed into art, that weakness could be forced into writing its own correction through the flesh. He preserved the needles as relics, washing and arranging them in rows, convinced that each had absorbed the lesson and could teach again. For the teachers who survived above, the effect was devastating. They did not know the details, but they saw the trembling grow among their peers, the stiffness in their hands, the dread that made them drop chalk in class. They whispered of bodies that could not stop shaking, of eyes that flickered as if caught in invisible seizures. Fear became visible in every movement, every touch of chalk to slate. They walked with rigid care, terrified that any weakness of hand or voice might summon them to the chamber, where their bodies would be made to write their failings in ways no ink could ever erase. Pembroke thrived on their terror. He believed the tremors that spread through the staff were signs of his doctrine's success, that their every shiver was a reminder of the needles waiting below. His obsession deepened, and with it, the conviction that science and ritual were one. He saw himself not only as a headmaster but as a reformer greater than those who preached mercy. While Guillotin sought to free men from pain, Pembroke sought to perfect them through it. And in this conviction he cemented his place not as a mere sadist, but as a scientist of cruelty. a craftsman of suffering whose classroom was not filled with books, but with bodies broken methodically, each one twitching its way into his scripture of silence and fear. Pembroke's obsession had moved from the tongue to the throat, from the breath to the nerves, and now it settled upon the bones. To him, the skeleton was the true foundation of order. Flesh was weak, blood was corruptible, voices carried disease, but bone was structure, bone was permanence. He convinced himself that the discipline of a teacher must not only be shown in voice or hand, but proven in the very strength of their frame. If the body could not endure the weight of order, then it deserved to collapse under its own failure. This belief gave rise to what he called the examination of bone, a ritual of correction that blurred the line between classroom and torture chamber with devastating finality. The desks were his creation, crafted in secret by blacksmiths he deceived with promises of reform. To the smiths, the iron frames were designed for discipline, heavy seats meant to keep restless boys upright. But once brought into the chamber, Pembroke modified them with his own hands. Iron bars ran along the spine, curved to press into the back, while thick screws connected them to weighted plates. By turning the screws, the plates would press harder and harder against the body seated within, tightening inch by inch until the bones groaned under the pressure. It was slow, precise, and to Pembroke, perfectly symbolic. Just as lessons were memorized line by line, just as obedience was carved day by day, so too must discipline be tested in increments until only the strongest survived. The first victim was a teacher of scripture who faltered during recitation, misquoting a verse in chapel before the children. Pembroke declared that the error had cracked the foundation of faith itself, and so her bones must be tested for strength. She was led into the chamber and seated in the iron desk, the heavy frame towering around her like a cage. Her arms were bound to the rests, her jaw fastened with a brace so that she could not close her mouth. A book of verses was placed before her, and Pembroke ordered her to recite from memory. With every mistake, he reached behind the desk and turned the screws, tightening the plates against her spine. At first, the pressure was bearable, a steady ache that forced her upright, her voice trembling as she tried to keep the lines correct. But as the screws turned, the ache sharpened into agony. The plates pressed deeper, grinding into her ribs, forcing her to gasp between words. She stumbled over a phrase, and the screws turned again. The sound of metal shifting against bone echoed in the chamber, a slow creak that seemed to stretch forever before the next word could escape her lips. Pembroke watched with the calm of an examiner, noting her errors, marking her body's resistance as though grading a test. The ritual continued until her spine bent against the iron, her body arching in unnatural contortions. Sweat poured down her face, her voice breaking, each verse spilling out like fragments of a dying prayer. The other teachers who heard faint echoes from above would later speak of the silence that followed, broken not by a scream but by a sound that could not be mistaken. The sudden crack of a body giving way. It was sharp, final, and then nothing. Pembroke leaned forward, listening with quiet reverence, convinced that the breaking was not a failure but a mark of completion, the lesson sealed into bone itself. He released the screws with measured care, allowing her body to slump, limp and useless, her frame no longer capable of carrying the weight of her duty. Her remains were disposed of with the same efficiency as the others, reduced to ash and folded into the doctrine that no parent would ever question. The examination of bone became a recurring ritual in his chamber, each time tailored to the weakness he claimed to correct. Teachers of mathematics were forced to solve problems aloud while the pressure grew, their miscalculations punished by new turns of the screws. Teachers of literature were commanded to recite passages, each forgotten line rewarded with pain that ground deeper into the spine. Deaths were slow, methodical, never sudden, for Pembroke believed that the lesson must last long enough for the body to understand it fully. He believed that bone itself remembered, that every crack and fracture was scripture written into the architecture of the body. The effect upon the remaining staff was profound. They began to carry themselves with stiff, unnatural posture, terrified of slouching or faltering in recitation. Some walked with boards strapped beneath their coats, desperate to appear unbending. Others drilled themselves late into the night, whispering lines until their voices gave out, trying to ensure they would never misstep under Pembroke's gaze. Yet the fear itself made them weaker, their memories slipping, their words faltering, their bones aching under the constant weight of terror. And with each mistake, Pembroke found justification to summon them, convinced that the doctrine was purifying not only the individual but the academy itself. Pembroke himself felt transformed by these rituals. Each crack of bone seemed to echo in his mind long after the chamber emptied, a sound he carried with him even in prayer. He began to believe it was not he who tightened the screws, but the hand of God guiding him. In his journal, he wrote that bones were pillars of truth, that their breaking was the cleansing of lies. He described himself as a mason shaping the foundation of the academy, one body at a time until the structure of Red Hollow would stand flawless, supported by the silence of those whose spines had been tested and broken beneath its weight. Pembroke's doctrine had consumed voice, breath, and bone, but he had come to believe that the eye was the most treacherous organ of all. To him, the gaze invited temptation, distraction, weakness. A teacher's eyes might wander from the text, linger too long upon a student, or glance away in fear when order demanded certainty. He wrote in his journal that the eye was the doorway through which corruption entered the mind, and that true devotion could only be reached when sight was abandoned. In Scripture, he underlined verses that spoke of cutting out the offending part, twisting them into justification for his next lesson. Where others saw light in the eye, Pembroke saw only danger. He would carve that danger away. The chapel was chosen as the stage for this ritual, for Pembroke wished it to be not hidden but sanctified. He believed that what was done there would echo through the walls of the academy like a hymn, binding the doctrine not only to the chamber below but to the very heart of the building's faith. Under cover of night, he led a group of teachers into the chapel, each one accused of allowing their gaze to falter during lessons. Some had been seen glancing at the clock when students failed. Others had lowered their eyes when Pembroke's own gaze fixed upon them. These small gestures, meaningless to any other, he declared as proof that their sight was corrupt. He bound them and rose before the altar, their arms shackled, their mouths gagged until the rite began. The candles burned low, their wax dripping like pale tears down the sides of the brass holders. Pembroke moved among them with steady hands, carrying a small scalpel and a cloth soaked in vinegar. His voice was calm, even tender, as he explained that he was removing distraction, that blindness would purify them, forcing their souls to focus on the eternal rather than the earthly. He began with the first teacher, pressing the blade beneath the lid, slicing cleanly, scooping out the eye with chilling precision. The muffled screams that followed rose in harmony with the organ pipes that groaned as the wind outside rattled the chapel windows. One by one, he repeated the act, moving down the line as though conducting a grotesque liturgy. Eyes fell to the stone floor, rolling like discarded marbles, pooling blood staining the altar cloth. The teachers writhed, their heads thrashing, yet the bindings held them firm. Pembroke whispered blessings as he worked, convinced that each removal was a sacrament, each empty socket a doorway closed to sin. By the time he reached the last, the chapel was filled with a sickening perfume of blood and wax, the altar glistening with crimson streaks beneath the flickering light. Then the true ritual began. He ordered the gags removed, forcing each blinded teacher to rise. Weak and trembling, they were guided into rows before the altar, their empty sockets weeping down their cheeks. Pembroke commanded them to sing hymns, his voice guiding them like a conductor directing a choir. Their voices wavered at first, broken by sobs and gasps, but under his insistence they rose together, trembling hymns filling the chapel. It was a sound unlike any other, notes strained through pain, verses cracked by blood loss, harmonies drenched in despair. Pembroke closed his eyes and listened with rapture, convinced that this was the truest music the Academy had ever known. The singing did not last long. One by one, the blinded teachers faltered. Their strength ebbed with every note, their knees buckling as the blood loss grew unbearable. Voices dropped out of the harmony until only a few remained, their cries fading into whispers, then silence. At last, the choir collapsed in a heap before the altar, their bodies tangled, mouths open in frozen song. The chapel, once alive with broken hymns, returned to silence, save for the dripping of blood onto the stone. Pembroke stood at the altar, his hands stained, his face calm, as if he had simply presided over a sacred service rather than a massacre. When dawn came, the bodies were quietly removed, carried to the furnace like the others, their absence explained away with meticulous lies. Pembroke claimed to the outside world that the teachers had been transferred, sent abroad on missions of service, their departures carefully documented in false letters bearing forged signatures. Parents believed, bishops nodded, and the Academy's prestige only grew. No one asked to see the choir again, and those who whispered of it in secret knew better than to speak aloud. For those who remained at Red Hollow, the toll was unbearable. Teachers avoided eye contact altogether, staring at their books or the ground, terrified that a glance in the wrong direction might condemn them to the altar. Students whispered that their masters walked like shadows, heads always bowed as though the Academy itself had gouged out their courage. Fear became a constant hymn in the halls, each step an echo of the choir's dying song. Pembroke himself carried the memory as a triumph. In his journal, he described the ritual as the most perfect lesson yet. He wrote that sight was the enemy of faith, that blindness had revealed the purest sound, voices lifted not by pride but by suffering. He called it the choir without eyes, and he believed it would echo forever within the Academy, an invisible hymn binding silence, pain, and obedience into one unbreakable doctrine. By the time the 16th teacher disappeared, the Academy's silence had become a way of life. The survivors moved like ghosts, speaking only when necessary, teaching lessons with mechanical precision while their eyes avoided every shadow. Pembroke's presence haunted each corridor, even when he was unseen. He had become less a headmaster than a force of nature, his doctrine stretching like chains around the school. Parents continued to praise the Academy's discipline. Bishops commended its piety. Nobles boasted of their sons' progress. The prestige of Red Hollow gleamed brighter than ever, but beneath the varnish its foundations were splintering with dread. Teachers wrote their own farewells in their minds long before Pembroke summoned them, and every locked door became a question. Was it safety, or was it the next step into the chamber? Rumors crept beyond the gates. Servants whispered of voices at night, of muffled cries that did not sound like students at all. Stable boys swore they saw black smoke rising from the furnace on nights when no fires should have burned. Some letters slipped past Pembroke's control, carrying fragments of fear to distant families. Yet when questions reached the patrons, they were dismissed as hysteria. The Academy was too valuable, too respected for scandal to be allowed. Pembroke had cultivated his reputation so well that any doubt was treated as slander, and the noble class closed ranks to protect what they saw as their finest institution. Fear ensured silence inside, power ensured silence outside. But when the 17th teacher vanished, the silence broke. He was a man of arithmetic, widely liked among the boys for his patience and fairness. Unlike others, his absence was noticed not only by staff but by a visiting inspector sent by the Ministry of Education. The inspector had been dispatched to evaluate Red Hollow's methods, for even in its prestige, questions lingered about its strictness. Pembroke welcomed him with his usual charm, leading him through the polished classrooms, the immaculate chapel, the library that stood as a monument to order. He spoke of discipline and excellence, of virtue and honor, all with the calm tone that had disarmed bishops and dukes alike. But the inspector was not blind. He saw the emptiness in the teachers' faces, the stiffness in their movements, the way silence gripped the academy more firmly than any lesson. He noticed the missing man's absence from the rolls, the blank line in the records, the bed still neatly made as though untouched. That night, while Pembroke presided over chapel, the inspector returned to the library. Something in the air there unsettled him. The books stood too neatly arranged, the silence pressed too heavily against his ears. He traced the rows until he found the false bookcase, its hinges faintly marked, its back warped with use. Curiosity pressed harder than caution. He pushed, and the case swung open, revealing the iron stair that descended into shadow. The air that rose from below was damp and foul, carrying with it a stench of rust and something far worse, something that clung to the throat like old blood. The inspector descended slowly, each step echoing against the stone, until the chamber revealed itself. He froze in the doorway, for what he saw was no classroom, no place of learning, but a tomb of horror built in layers of ritual. The walls were stained with chalk and blood, the scrawled errors of the vanished still visible through smears of red. Desks of iron stood like instruments of war, their screws still glistening with dark residue. On one table lay the shattered remains of ivory needles, each stained as though dipped in the veins of the living. A blackboard loomed in the corner, its surface gray with dust that carried the ashes of those consumed. Across it, words scratched by desperate hands remained half-finished, obituaries broken by the collapse of breath. And carved into the wood of the furniture were messages, pleas, prayers, fragments of madness etched by fingernails and blades. Forgive me. He watches. Silence is death. Each message testified to suffering so deep that even death had not been quick enough to erase it. The inspector stumbled back, his chest tightening with a nausea that threatened to consume him. He knew at once that no illness, no resignation could explain this. This was deliberate. This was methodical. This was evil crafted with devotion, masked by respectability, hidden beneath the finest library in England. He fled the chamber, his steps frantic against the iron stair, his hands shaking as he slammed the bookcase shut. The next morning he delivered his report not to Pembroke but directly to the ministry. Within days, men arrived to shutter the academy. Parents received notices of closure, students were withdrawn, servants dismissed. The gates of Red Hollow clanged shut, its reputation erased in a single breath. But Pembroke himself was gone. When officials entered to confront him, his chambers were empty, his journals missing, his clothing abandoned in neat order as though he had dressed for departure and never returned. Some believed he had escaped into the night, aided by the same patrons who once praised him. Others whispered that he had vanished the same way his victims had, consumed by the building itself. The chamber remained, its walls stained, its instruments rusting, silent now but heavy with memory. Yet no trial was ever held, no justice delivered. The horror of Red Hollow ended not with confession or punishment, but with disappearance, the mastermind dissolving into myth as his victims had dissolved into ash. The academy never reopened. Its windows were boarded, its doors locked, its name stricken from the rolls of learning. Yet those who had entered the chamber could never forget what they saw. The walls spoke even in silence. the desperate carvings outlasting the screams, the chalk dust clinging in the lungs of all who breathed it. Red Hollow collapsed not with fire or ruin, but with revelation, its prestige shattered, its truth too unbearable to ever be spoken aloud in public. To this day, the fate of Dr. Alaric Pembroke remains unknown, his figure lingering like a shadow in history, vanished, yet never gone. When the gates of Red Hollow were finally locked and its corridors left to dust, the silence that followed carried more weight than any hymn that had ever echoed through its chapel. The families of the vanished teachers were given no answers. Their names were erased from records, their wages halted, their belongings quietly returned to relatives with forged signatures suggesting they had left of their own will. For the world outside, Red Hollow collapsed in disgrace, its shining reputation undone by whispers too dark to ignore. But even in ruin, the true depth of what had occurred inside its walls was never spoken aloud. No trial was held, no sentence delivered. The building stood empty, yet the shadow of Pembroke lingered as though he had built not just an academy, but a monument to a silence that outlived him. In Parliament, the scandal was reframed into something safer. Committees convened not to speak of torture or ritual, but of irregularities in oversight. Reports cited poor record-keeping, insufficient inspections, and the dangers of giving headmasters unchecked authority. Out of this came new laws. Schools required to submit regular audits, independent inspectors mandated to interview staff without supervision, records of employment to be confirmed by outside clerks rather than trusted to a single hand. These reforms were praised as progress, as though bureaucracy could erase what had happened. But the true horrors of Red Hollow remained hidden between walls now boarded shut, buried beneath the official language of policy. Among the teachers of England, however, the memory did not vanish. Red Hollow became a whispered warning, a cautionary tale traded in staff rooms and behind closed doors. They spoke of it not as history, but as possibility, a reminder that authority could turn at any moment, that institutions built on trust could devour the very people meant to uphold them. To some, Pembroke was a figure of fear. To others, a cautionary example of what happens when devotion curdles into obsession. Yet there were a few who read his absence not as condemnation, but as power. His journals, thought lost, surfaced decades later in fragments, pages preserved by unknown hands, copied in secret, circulated among those who believed that discipline must be enforced at any cost. In those writings, Pembroke was not a monster but a prophet of order. His rituals described not as torture but as purification. In the early years of the 20th century, small circles of educators began to adopt his words in distorted ways. They called themselves reformers, preaching the necessity of silence, obedience, and punishment as virtues. Some built private schools where children were forbidden to speak without permission, where errors were corrected with humiliations that echoed Pembroke's own designs. One headmaster was rumored to force pupils to write their mistakes hundreds of times with fingers raw from caning, insisting that failure be inscribed upon the body. Another demanded long hours of kneeling on salt, declaring it a lesson in endurance. Though these acts never reached the scale of Red Hollow, they bore the mark of its doctrine, spreading Pembroke's ghost into classrooms long after the academy's collapse. The ruin itself stood for decades, a husk on the hill where ivy strangled its walls and windows shattered under storms. Locals avoided it, claiming to hear faint hymns at night, voices singing in cracked unison as though the choir without eyes still echoed in the chapel. Some swore they saw light flickering in the library even after its shelves had been stripped, as if the chamber beneath still breathed. Children dared one another to approach the gates, daring to touch the iron and flee before silence fell too heavily on their ears. No one stayed long. Even empty, Red Hollow was alive with memory, its stones saturated with the suffering of those who had been consumed by Pembroke's doctrine. The legacy of the 17 vanished teachers was not written in memorials. No statues were raised, no plaques engraved with their names. Their stories survived instead in the margins of inspection reports, in the whispered recollections of descendants who knew only that an ancestor had gone to Red Hollow and never returned. Their suffering became part of England's unspoken history, carried like a scar beneath the skin of institutions that never dared to speak their name. Pembroke himself remained a figure without an ending. Some believed he escaped abroad carrying his journals to new lands. Others believed he walked into the forest surrounding the academy and never returned, consumed by the silence he had worshipped. And there were those who believed the truth was darker, that he had never left Red Hollow at all, that his body still rested somewhere in the chamber, hidden like his victims, his doctrine preserved not in his life, but in the fear he left behind. The collapse of Red Hollow revealed a truth that few dared face. Evil does not always come dressed in chains or cloaked in madness. More often, it wears respectability hiding behind doctrine framed by the walls of institutions that society is too proud to question. Pembroke was not a stranger in the night. He was a headmaster admired by dukes, trusted by bishops, invited into the halls of power. His cruelty thrived not because it was invisible, but because it was ignored. Because those who suspected chose silence rather than scandal. The greatest horror of Red Hollow was not the chamber itself, but the ease with which it was allowed to exist. Even now, the story lingers as a question, heavy and unresolved. What safeguards can ever prevent such silence from returning? How many institutions built on trust conceal rooms no one dares open? How often does devotion mask obsession? And how easily do we look away when prestige stands in the way of truth? The story of Red Hollow ends not with justice, but with disappearance of victims of their tormentor, of the academy itself. But its shadow endures, whispering a warning to those who are willing to listen. And so the narration closes with a single, haunting reflection. True evil rarely declares itself. It hides in doctrine, in ritual, in the silence of those who know but do not speak. What do you think? Could this happen again?